First Lady Melania Trump is again breaking with her husband, this time defending NBA superstar LeBron James, who the president insulted on Twitter. On Friday, Trump tweeted, LeBron James was just interviewed by the dumbest man on television, Don Lemon. He made LeBron look smart, which isn't easy to do. I like Mike. Trump was referring to a CNN interview in which James criticized the president as being divisive.
What I noticed over the last few months, that he's kind of used sport to kind of divide us, and that's something that I can't relate to because I know that sport was the first time I ever was around someone white, you know, and I got an opportunity to see them and learn about them.
What would you say to the president if he's sitting right here?
I would never sit across from him.
The interview was part of James's effort to promote the new school he just opened for at-risk students in his hometown of Akron, Ohio. He did not respond to Trump's attack, but First Lady Melania Trump did. Her spokesperson saying, quote, "It looks like LeBron James is working to do good things on behalf of our next generation," adding she would be open to visiting the I Promise school in Akron. All right, I need to go through this. Joining me now, Washington Post opinion writer, my friend Jonathan Capehart, Republican strategist Rick Tyler, and the one and only Kara Swisher, executive editor of Recode. All right, Jonathan, to you first, why would President Trump attack not just a wildly popular athlete like LeBron James, but specifically on this week when he has spent millions and millions of dollars to help underprivileged kids in the state of Ohio? You might not even like LeBron James, but you're going to back him after something like this.
Yeah, I think, President Trump is all about distraction. So by going after one of the most popular athletes in the country, that's part of it. The other part of it is that he sort of, I guess, hate watches Don Lemon, and he has attacked Don Lemon in the past. And so that's part of it. The other part of it, and the more pernicious part of it, is that he can't stand the fact that there is an African American who is probably as famous, if not more famous, more highly regarded than he is, doing something that is actually real and pertinent in the lives of his community. There is no denying that what LeBron James did last week was extraordinary. Not just opening a school for 240 at-risk youth. It's what that school does. Free tuition, free uniforms, transportation if you live within 2 miles, job placement programs for the parents of these children. This is the sort of holistic approach that, a functioning U.S. government would be nurturing, would be fostering, would be celebrating. Instead, we have the President of the United States taking to Twitter, rage tweeting against a private citizen doing good.
But this is the exact kind of thing Ivanka Trump should be all over and loving. Rick, I want you to help me. You're a Republican strategist here. When I read Charles Blow, the opinion writer, right, the man is trying to help at-risk children by opening doors for them, was being attacked by the man who has put children at risk by locking them in cages. When I read that tweet, I was standing in line at Acme, and I could hear him drop a mic from 1,000 miles away. How is this a good strategy for the president?
It's a terrible strategy. Look, I think the thing, and Jonathan's right, and building on what Jonathan said, I think when LeBron James says that he would not sit with Donald Trump, I think that so got under his skin, and he clearly was hate watching Don Lemon. But look, the president is, and well, let me start with Melania and Ivanka here. There's a lot of people around the president, including his family, who are very consumed or want to manage their public personas, their public image. And the problem is, and it's remarkable that President Trump, they have to actually distance themselves and try to preserve their own reputation based on what their husband or their father says. That's just a really remarkable thing.
Except in this case, Melania Trump wasn't asked. Ivanka addresses things when she sits down for an interview and she's asked straight on and she's forced to address it. Kara, you tweeted so much to unpack here. Float is trying to make another run for the exit. This was on a Saturday. She was not at a press conference. There was no press briefing. Yeah. She voluntarily put this statement out. Like, this guy's coming back from a round of golf and she's going, here's your BLT. Guess what I just did in the last hour?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's so highly dysfunctional. I think, there's two thing is I then tweeted after that, maybe it's all part of he gets to do the crazy stuff for the base, and then they get to say, no, some of us disagree with them and we're normal. So I don't even know what's going on here in terms of the uses of both social media and statements and cross statements. I think John is right. It's a distraction, and it's someone who either they're doing it in a very calculating way, or it's someone who doesn't have control of their thumbs, essentially. And it's hard to say what, but I think a lot of the people around him that are trying to distance themselves are almost as bad as he is in a lot of ways, because they stay there and continue to support this mostly, and at the same time want to have the ability to say, well, we don't like this part of it or we don't like that part of it. So it's all a little distasteful overall for the whole group of them to be doing this, I think, and especially when LeBron James is doing something so wonderful for kids. So but it's a real contrast.
They say that, but does it actually have any meaning? Rick, there's loads of business leaders that have said, well, listen, I really like his policies. We just ignore his tweets. But if I'm Dan Gilbert, who owns the Cavaliers, if I'm any of the NBA owners or any other team, this puts a huge amount of strain on them. They are public people. They do make public statements that they now have to get in the middle of this.
No,
well, it puts strain on them. But sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, look, everybody who comes in contact with Donald Trump and has pledged fealty to him seems to they're tarnished and tainted with that image. The problem with Donald Trump is he holds a lot of very old views. He holds very old views on race, and I think that. And on women, and on the jobs of the future. You know, you combine all those things, and his base represents sort of the last gasp of a 19th century mindset. You know, we want to go into the future with ideas, new ideas, and Donald Trump represents the last gasp of the past. So, look, I think this is the end of that, and we'll get through it. But in the meantime, he just continues to embarrass himself and his family members, apparently.
Kara, according to the New York Times, Trump has insulted someone via Twitter at least 487 times. Is there a point in which Twitter says, this is a violation of our ethics, we're going to shut you down?
Oh, funny you should say that. I'm writing about that this week in the next column. You know, I don't think so. I think Twitter has sort of laid out the position that he's the president and what he says is important, and therefore we're going to publish it. I think there probably is a Rubicon he could cross, but he hasn't crossed it yet, for Twitter at least. And it's hard to say what it would take to do that. And so the question is, you know, will some of these social media companies, which have a lot of power, start to throttle things back? You saw Apple today pulling Alex Jones' InfoWars off of iTunes in the podcasts, which was a big step. It's a value step. It's like, this is not allowed on our platform. And we'll see if these companies will continue to do that, even as they have these very strong First Amendment arguments on the other side. But it's a complicated issue, and it's not easily reduced to just, I'm for free speech or I'm against it.
Jonathan, last point, the LeBron issue. Is it over and done with? Is this just the president's 487th insult and it moves on? We haven't heard back from Mr. James.
No, and I would be very surprised if we do hear back from LeBron James. He doesn't need to respond to the president. He's a bigger person, a bigger man than the president, and I think he should just keep doing what he's doing. Look, the president will come back and he'll attack Don Lemon, he'll attack LeBron James the same way he continually attacks Maxine Waters and other people, particularly people of color and especially women of color. He'll keep coming back at it as long as, one, it allows him to vent, and two, he gets approval from his base.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.